Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here to unwind and relax. This video is designed to help you calm your mind and drift off to sleep. Before you settle in, consider liking and subscribing for more calming content. Your support means a lot. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to hear from you. Now, let's get cozy. The rain had been falling steadily all day. A steady pulse against the tall windows of 53rd Street Apartments, a 6-story rental building just off Park Avenue. The apartment stood in the heart of the city, with a view of the nearby Central Park, though tonight, all anyone could see was a blur of rain and the dim glow of streetlights reflected on the slick pavement. It was the kind of storm that blanketed the city in mist, muffling the usual hustle, leaving the streets eerily quiet. Occasional flashes of headlights cut through the gloom, but the sidewalks were empty, as if the whole neighborhood had retreated behind their doors, avoiding more than just the weather. Inside the old brick building, the sound of rain was constant, a soft drumming on the windows and a distant growl of thunder. But it wasn't just the storm that felt oppressive tonight. For Simone, Mateo, Emma, Tyler, and Lexi, each living on a different floor, the rain was a familiar companion, a background hum to their isolated routines. They were neighbors, but not in the way that mattered. Passing glances in the lobby, a shared elevator ride, perhaps the occasional polite nod in the hallway. Nothing more. They didn't know each other's names, but soon the storm would make them feel closer than they ever imagined. As the storm raged outside, something else stirred within the walls of 53rd Street Apartments. Each of them could feel it, an unsettling presence weaving itself into their thoughts, lurking just beyond the edge of their awareness. The air felt heavier than usual, like the building itself was holding its breath. They told themselves it was just the rain, just another stormy night in Manhattan. But deep down, they knew this wasn't just a storm. Something was coming, and it had already found its way inside. Part 1, second floor. Simone. The rain pattered against the windows of my tiny apartment, its rhythm almost soothing as I curled up on the worn-out couch. This place wasn't much, but it was mine. After everything at home, the screaming, the smashing of bottles, the late-night arguments, I needed a space where I could breathe, somewhere my father's rage couldn't reach me. 53rd Street Apartments was the only place I could afford, and it wasn't ideal. The walls were thin, the pipes groaned, and sometimes the lights flickered like they were protesting my very presence. But here, I could focus on my studies, far away from the chaos I grew up in. The rain always helped drown out the noise, but tonight, the storm wasn't calming. Something about the steady drumming made me feel restless. I flipped through the pages of my psychology textbook, trying to concentrate, but the words blurred together. My mind kept drifting back to the last time I saw my dad. His eyes were bloodshot, and he reeked of whiskey, yelling something about me being ungrateful for leaving. I'd slammed the door behind me, and I hadn't looked back. Since then, I'd been trying to rebuild myself in this dingy apartment, focusing on school, telling myself I'd never go back. But lately, something hadn't been right here. Not since I started hearing the noises. It began a few days ago. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds of the old building. The pipes creaking, footsteps from the floors above. But this was different. It sounded like muffled voices, low, unintelligible murmurs coming from behind the walls. Tonight was worse. The muffled voices had started up again, drifting through the walls like a cold draft. They seemed to be getting louder, angrier, and no matter how hard I tried to concentrate on my studies, I couldn't escape them. They were always there, lurking in the background, tugging at the edge of my mind. I leaned back in my chair and glanced out the window. The storm outside was relentless, the kind that made the city feel distant and strange. The parking lot was mostly empty, the streetlights casting long shadows across the rain-soaked pavement. That's when I saw him. The guy from the 6th floor. I didn't know much about him, only that he kept to himself. He looked like he was in his mid-30s, with short brown hair and always a bit of stubble on his face, like shaving was the least of his worries. I'd seen him a few times, coming home with grocery bags late at night, always looking exhausted. But tonight, he was just standing there. He was in the parking lot, holding a paper cup of coffee, staring out into the rain as if he were lost in thought. His posture was tense, shoulders hunched, like the weight of something unseen pressed down on him. He wasn't even sipping the coffee, just holding it, his gaze fixed on the rain, as if he could see something beyond it that the rest of us couldn't. I watched him for a few moments, unsettled by how still he was, how disconnected from everything around him. It was as if the storm didn't matter, as if he didn't care that he was getting soaked. The coffee in his hand must have gone cold by now, but he just stood there, staring at nothing. Something about it unnerved me. There was a darkness in his expression, a haunted look that made me wonder if he was seeing the same things I was hearing. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the walls. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. Muffled voices seemed to come from behind the wall, growing in intensity, though I couldn't make out the words. I pressed my ear to the cold plaster, listening, trying to make sense of them. The voice sounded familiar. It took me a moment to place it, but when I did, a cold chill ran down my spine. It was my father's voice, but that was impossible. He was miles away, back in the house I'd left behind. There was no way I could be hearing him now. My hands shook as I pulled away from the wall, backing up into the middle of the room. The muffled voices faded, but the sound of my father's low, drunken mumbling lingered in my mind. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a loud thud echoed from the ceiling above me. I glanced up, heart in my throat. I knew the guy who lived above me, an older man, a widower. We'd exchanged smiles in passing. He seemed nice enough, but there was something sad about him, like he was weighed down by the emptiness of his life. Maybe the old man was moving furniture or something. Anything to explain away the sound. But the muffled voices were still there, faint now, but unmistakable.
You think you're free?
A voice boomed, just on the other side of the wall. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. My father's voice. It couldn't be. He was miles away, back at the house I'd left behind.
You think you can escape me, Simone?
The voice was low, mocking, filled with that same venom he'd spat at me the night I left.
You'll never be free.
I stumbled toward the door, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the lock. But the muffled voices were everywhere now, growing louder, circling me. The lights flickered, and the room grew colder.
You belong to me. You always will.
No, go away!
I cried out, yanking the door open and bolting down the hallway. The sound of my father's voice chasing me into the storm outside. I stumbled into the rain, the cold drops soaking through my clothes. But I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the parking lot. I stood there, panting, heart racing, trying to catch my breath. And then I saw the sixth floor guy again. He hadn't moved, still standing there in the rain, still clutching his coffee cup, still staring blankly into the storm. I shivered, but not from the cold. Something was wrong with him. He looked empty, hollow. For a moment, his eyes flicked toward me, locking on mine. There was no emotion there, just a deep, hollow emptiness. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. He gave me a slow, almost mechanical nod, then turned and walked back toward the building, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there, drenched and shaking, wondering what kind of nightmares we were both running from. But the rain wasn't washing them away. It was only making them worse. Part 2. 5th floor. Lexi. I barely remember what it's like to sleep through the night anymore. The world outside is quiet at 3 in the afternoon, but my body aches with exhaustion. I'd just gotten home from another long night at the 24-hour grocery store on 57th Street. The rain hadn't let up since I stepped out of the store. It followed me all the way back to 53rd Street Apartments, where I dragged myself up to my 5th floor apartment, the sound of the downpour pounding in my ears. As I kicked off my shoes, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off today. Not just the storm, but something smaller, something that crawled under my skin and stayed there. Right before my shift ended, the clock read 6:45 a.m., and I was counting the minutes until I could clock out when a couple walked in. Just as I was straightening up the checkout counter, I'd seen them a few times before. A tall man and a shorter woman, always with their little girl. But this time, they were alone. Just the two of them. "Morning," the man muttered, grabbing a pack of gum and placing it on the counter. His wife barely glanced at me, fiddling with her phone as the rain beat down outside. It struck me then how strange it was. The few times they'd come in before, they always had the kid with them, usually holding her hand or carrying her on their shoulders. But not today. I smiled awkwardly, handing over their change, but they didn't say much else. Just left without a word, vanishing into the morning mist, leaving me with a heavy feeling in my chest that followed me home. Now, back in my apartment, I tried to push the thought away. It wasn't any of my business. People leave their kids home all the time. It wasn't weird. At least, it shouldn't have been. I made my way to the kitchen, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent apartment. The rain blurred the world outside my window, turning the city into a hazy backdrop, and somewhere far off, a crack of thunder rumbled. The sound above me started again, that familiar scraping noise I'd heard almost every day since I moved in. It started as faint thuds, like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. At first, I thought nothing of it. Buildings make noise, right? But lately, it had become more deliberate, more calculated, like it was waiting for me. I stopped in the middle of the kitchen, straining to listen. The noise seemed to follow me, moving from one side of the ceiling to the other, then stopping abruptly. It was almost as if someone was listening to... A chill crept up my spine. I sighed, rubbing my eyes. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe it was all in my head. Night shifts tend to dull your senses, make you numb to odd things. But as I collapsed onto the couch, pulling a blanket over myself, the scraping above grew louder, more deliberate. It wasn't random anymore. It was like someone knew I was here. I'd never met the neighbors in the apartment above me. I assumed someone lived there, though I'd never heard voices or footsteps. Just that dragging noise. In fact, now that I thought about it, I didn't remember seeing anyone ever going in or out. No lights in the windows, nothing. But someone had to be up there, right? I grabbed my phone, instinctively pulling up the building's directory to check who lived on the 6th floor. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe they'd just moved in. Someone shifting furniture around or setting up a new place. But when I scanned the tenant list, there was no name for 6B, just a blank space. That couldn't be right. I stared at the screen, scrolling back and forth, as if I'd somehow missed it. But no, 6B was listed as vacant. Empty. For months it seemed. So what, was making that noise? The scraping resumed, louder this time, directly above me. My heart started pounding in my chest. It was impossible. No one could be up there, but the sound was unmistakable. I grabbed my keys, ignoring the nagging feeling that I should just stay put. Curiosity outweighed my fear. I needed to know what was going on. The hallway outside my apartment was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering as if the storm had seeped into the building's wiring. The elevator was out, as it always was on nights like this, so I took the stairs, each step echoing in the empty stairwell. The rain pounded against the narrow window at the landing, making it feel like I was walking into something far worse than just another creaky old apartment. By the time I reached the 6th floor, my pulse was racing. The hallway was dead quiet. No sounds of TVs or muffled conversations, like there usually were in a building with paper-thin walls. I hesitated outside the door marked 6B. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. No scraping. No movement. Just the low hum of the building settling in the storm. I tried the knob, half expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dim and gloomy apartment. Faint afternoon sunlight casting soft shadows onto the walls. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, shining the beam into the space. Empty. Completely and utterly empty. No furniture. No signs of life. Just a vast, dark, open room with dusty floors and bare walls. I took a few cautious steps inside, my breath shallow, the light bouncing off the walls in jagged streaks. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. The slam echoed through the empty apartment. My breath caught in my throat, and the beam of my phone light quivered in the darkness. I whipped around, heart racing, and shined the light back toward the entryway. No one was there. The apartment was dead silent, too silent. I stood frozen, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe the wind blew the door shut. Maybe it was just my nerves getting the best of me. But deep down, I knew better. There was something here. Something wrong. I took another step forward, the sound of my own shoes loud against the bare floor. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the weak beam of my phone light. I scanned the room, every corner bathed in shadow. My pulse thudded in my ears, drowning out the faint rumble of thunder outside. Then I heard it. A faint rustling, coming from the far corner of the room. I instinctively aimed it toward the noise, my hand trembling. The beam caught nothing but empty space, but the sound. The sound was unmistakable. The slow shuffle of feet moving across the floor. I wasn't alone.
Hello?
I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No response. But the shuffling grew louder, coming closer, circling me. My breath quickened, fear tightening in my chest. I backed toward the door, my hand reaching for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Somehow, from the inside. Then, from the shadows, I heard it. A voice, low and almost mocking, filled with a twisted sort of patience.
You've been keeping me awake all this time. Now, it's my turn.
Panic surged through me. I tugged harder at the door, my fingers slipping on the cold metal knob. The voice came again, closer this time, almost at my ear.
It's my turn now.
I twisted the knob with all my strength, and finally, the door flew open. I stumbled out into the hallway, slamming the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. The scraping, the voice, the presence. It all disappeared the moment I was outside. The silence of the 6th floor swallowed everything once more, leaving only the sound of the rain tapping gently against the windows. I fled down the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest, my legs barely carrying me fast enough. I could hear the rain slashing against the windows in the stairwell, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Just as I rounded the landing between the 6th and 5th floors, I nearly collided with someone. A man, tall, with short brown hair, unshaven, and wearing a faded grey hoodie. He looked startled, his tired eyes widening as I rushed past him. I recognized him from the few times we'd passed each other in the building. I'd seen him once or twice getting his mail, or coming home late with bags from the grocery store. His face always seemed a little drawn, like he hadn't slept in days. He glanced at me with confusion, brow furrowed.
You okay?
He asked, his voice rough, like he'd just woken up. I couldn't stop to answer, my breath catching in my throat. All I could manage was a hurried nod before I bolted down the stairs, taking them 2 at a time. Behind me, I heard the man call out again, but his voice was drowned out by the storm and the pounding of my heart. I didn't look back, didn't dare explain. I just needed to get out of there. Part 3, 3rd floor. Tyler. I had just returned from the hospital, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on my aching joints. The doctors told me it was pneumonia, common at my age, they said. But the tightness in my chest, the wheezing that came with every breath, reminded me of how fragile I had become. My wife, Marie-Anne, had passed away a year ago, and ever since, I'd been left to face the slow decay of old age alone. The late afternoon air was heavy with the scent of rain as I shuffled into my apartment, heaving from the effort of climbing 3 floors up. My legs ached, and the damp chill had settled deep into my bones. I stood in the doorway for a moment, trying to catch my breath, the storm outside howling like a wounded animal. I wiped the moisture from my brow. Normally, I'd find comfort in the familiar sounds of the apartment. The creaks in the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator. But tonight, it all felt different. Hollow, somehow. Like the place had lost its warmth, its soul. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and moved about the apartment in my usual routine. Boiling water for a cup of coffee, heating up the leftover soup on the stove. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Marie-Anne's cooking, or at least that's what I told myself. I liked to imagine she was still here, moving around behind me, making sure I didn't burn the pot. But it was just me, just the sounds of my movements filling the silence. As the coffee dripped into the pot, I noticed something unusual. There was a note taped to the door. Odd, considering no one ever visited me. I hobbled over, pulling it from the handle and squinting at the writing in the dim light.
Hi, we're your neighbors from the 4th floor. We don't know you, but we've said hi a few times in the building. This is urgent. We had to leave in a rush, and our daughter Emma is alone in the apartment. Could you check on her? Please help to see if she's okay, if she's scared. We don't know how long we will be out.
The handwriting was shaky, hurried. I frowned, the words swirling in my head as I reread them. I'd never really spoken to Emma's parents before, just a few nods and hellos in passing. The idea that they would leave their little girl behind in the middle of a storm, in a building like this, something about it felt wrong. The storm seemed to howl louder outside, rattling the windows as I crumpled the note in my hand. I had to see if she was all right. A little girl, alone in this building, with everything going on. It gnawed at me. I grabbed my coat and shuffled out into the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. It was near evening, and the dim sunlight was casting eerie shadows on the walls as I made my way to the 4th floor. As I approached their door, my heart sank. The door was slightly ajar, creaking with the wind, and the apartment beyond was dark.
Emma, it's Mr. Tyler from downstairs.
I called out, my voice rough and weak. No answer, only the sound of the rain outside and the occasional creak of the old building. I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The apartment was in disarray. Toys scattered on the floor, dishes left on the counter. But it was the silence that unnerved me most. The absence of any sign of life. I moved through the small living room, peeking around corners, looking for Emma.
Emma, where are you?
I called again, softer this time. The sound of my own voice seemed to hang in the air, unanswered. That's when I saw her. She was sitting in a corner of her bedroom, knees pulled up to her chest, her tiny body trembling. Her eyes were wide, staring at the wall, but it was as if she wasn't seeing anything at all, pale as a ghost, her skin almost translucent in the dim light.
Emma.
I knelt down slowly, my body protesting with each movement.
It's okay. I'm here. Where are your parents?
For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said,
They didn't come back.
I swallowed, my throat dry.
What happened?
Her gaze shifted slightly, just enough to meet mine, and the terror in her eyes was something I hadn't seen since Marianne's passing. It was the kind of fear that clung to you, the kind that left you hollow.
There was someone here.
She whispered.
Someone in the walls.
I blinked, unsure of what to say. The walls.
They were talking to me.
She continued, her voice shaking.
I could hear them, and then the shadows moved.
My heart tightened. I wanted to tell her it was just her imagination, just a trick of the storm in the dark, but I couldn't. The whispers she described, I'd heard them too. Late at night, when the wind was howling and the apartment felt too quiet, I'd always brushed them off, convinced they were just my mind playing tricks on me in the loneliness of these empty rooms. But now, hearing it from her, a girl so young, so innocent.
Emma, you're safe now.
I said, though I wasn't sure if it was true.
Come with me. We'll figure out what's going on.
She shook her head violently.
No. They said they'd come back for me. If I left the room, they'd come for me.
I knelt closer, trying to meet her eyes again, trying to break through the fear.
Emma, who said that?
She looked at the wall, her small body trembling,
The voice in the walls.
I glanced at the wall, trying to see what she saw, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was nothing. Just the peeling wallpaper, the cracks in the plaster. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, but unmistakable.
They'll never come back.
I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was a voice, faint but real, coming from behind the wall. My blood ran cold.
Come on,
I said, standing up and holding out my hand.
we're leaving.
Emma looked up at me, her eyes filled with terror, but she slowly reached out and took my hand. I led her out of the apartment, my mind racing with questions. What had happened to her parents? Where had they gone? And why had they left her alone with whatever that was? As we stepped into the hallway, I glanced back at the open door of her apartment, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching us. The shadows seemed to cling to the walls, following us. The storm was getting worse outside, the wind howling through the gaps in the windows, as if urging me to hurry. Back in my own apartment, I settled Emma on the couch, wrapping a blanket around her trembling frame. She looked so small, so vulnerable, like a bird fallen from its nest. I made her some hot chocolate, trying to calm my racing heart as I stood in the kitchen. The familiar sounds of the stove and the clatter of cups grounding me, if only for a moment. But then I heard it. A creak behind me. I froze, the spoon hovering over the cup. That sound, it was unmistakable. The creak of the floorboards right behind me. It was the same sound I used to hear every night when Marie-Anne would walk from the kitchen to the bedroom. The same gentle rhythm of her feet on the old wood, the sound that had once been so comforting. But Marie-Anne wasn't here anymore. She hadn't been for over a year. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I'd had a long day, I was tired. The storm, the hospital, the worry over Emma. It was all too much. Of course, I'd hear things that weren't there. But then, it happened again. Another creak, this time closer. It came from the narrow hallway leading to the bedroom. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The apartment was still, the shadows long and distorted by the flickering streetlight outside. But the sound of footsteps didn't stop. It moved steadily, further and further, until it reached the door to the bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen in the kitchen, unable to move, unable to think. Then I heard it. A soft, familiar whisper.
Ty, it's time to come to bed.
The voice was unmistakable. Marie-Anne's voice. Gentle, sweet, just as I remembered it. The way she used to call me when she was tired, ready to settle in for the night. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white, as I stared at the hallway. The bedroom door was half open, the darkness beyond it feeling like a void waiting to swallow me.
Ty, come to bed.
I should have run. I should have told myself it was just the storm, just my mind betraying me after a day filled with too much stress. But I couldn't ignore it. My legs moved on their own, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the bedroom. The hallway felt longer than it ever had before, stretching out before me like an endless tunnel. The storm raged on outside, thunder rumbling in the distance, but all I could hear was that voice, Marie-Anne's voice, calling me home. I reached the bedroom door and pushed it open, the hinges creaking softly as I stepped inside. The room was dim, only the faint light from the street lamp casting shadows on the walls. My breath caught in my throat as I saw the silhouette of someone lying in the bed. It was her, Marie Anne. I could see the outline of her body beneath the blankets. Her familiar shape turned toward me as if she had just settled in, waiting for me to join her. The room smelled faintly of her perfume, that rose scent she always wore. For a moment, I stood there, staring, feeling my heart swell with both longing and terror. I had missed her so much. Her presence, her warmth, the sound of her voice. And now she was here, calling me back to her like nothing had ever changed. I took a step closer, my hand reaching out toward the bed. But as I neared the bedside, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the shadows. The air grew cold, the scent of rose replaced by the musty smell of an old, empty room. My hand fell to my side as I stared at the bed, empty except for the neatly folded covers, as if someone had just been there but had left moments before. I stood there, heart racing, trying to comprehend what I had just seen, or thought I had seen.
Marie-Anne?
I whispered, my voice shaking. But there was no response. Just the sound of the storm outside and the hollow emptiness of the apartment. I backed away slowly, my legs trembling, and turned to leave the room. But as I reached the doorway, a cold whisper brushed past my ear, sending chills down my spine.
You'll never be alone, Ty.
I didn't dare turn around. I fled back into the living room, where Emma was curled up on the couch, still pale and scared. I didn't tell her what had just happened, didn't mention the voice or the figure in the bed, but I knew then, just like she did, we weren't alone. Not anymore. Part 4. 6th floor. Mateo. The rain had been falling since the early morning. A heavy, steady downpour that blurred the city lights outside my 6th floor apartment. I stared out the window, watching the rain trickle down in uneven paths across the glass. It had become a habit, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee in my hands, the steam long gone cold, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me. 3 months. That's how long it had been since she left. The divorce had been quick and merciless, leaving me in this tiny apartment, surrounded by walls that felt like they were closing in a little more each day. I'd rented it because it was cheap, a place where I could try to piece myself back together. But most nights, I didn't feel like piecing anything together. Most nights, I just sat here, feeling like the storm outside was a reflection of what was happening inside me. The silence was the worst part. After years of hearing her voice in the background, the absence was suffocating. I didn't know how to fill it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. It was easier to just let the quiet consume me. I grabbed my grey hoodie and a pack of cigarettes from the counter. Smoking was another habit I'd picked up again after the divorce. One of the few things that helped me clear my head, even if just for a few minutes. Downstairs, under the awning by the entrance of the building, I lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply. The rain beat down steadily, even at 4 in the afternoon, the distant rumble of thunder rolling through the air. There was something soothing about it, standing there in the storm, letting the cold mist settle on my skin. The rain had a way of drowning out the thoughts that wouldn't leave me alone, the ones that followed me every waking moment. I stood there for a while, just taking it all in. The smoke curled from my lips, dissolving into the rain. It was still early, too early to worry about the empty night ahead. Eventually, I dropped the cigarette, crushing it under my shoe, and turned to head back inside. The elevator had been out for days, so I made my way to the stairs. As I opened the door of the lobby, I saw my third-floor neighbor, an old man standing in front of the elevator, staring at the flashing not in order sign. The old man had probably been in the building longer than most. He looked frail today, his face pale and drawn, like he'd just gotten back from a long trip. His shoulders slumped under the weight of his coat, his hands trembling slightly as he turned slowly toward the stairwell. His movements were labored, each step small and careful, like he wasn't sure his legs would hold him. For a second, I thought about offering to help, but something held me back, the quiet distance that seemed to hang between all of us in this building. Instead, I hurried up myself, my footsteps echoing in the dim, narrow stairwell. As I reached the landing between the 6th and 5th floors, I nearly collided with someone. The 5th floor lady, one of the few people in the building I saw regularly, but only in passing. She was always coming or going at odd hours, usually looking worn out. We'd never had much more than a nod or brief hello in the elevator, but I'd noticed things about her over time. She always wore her hair tied back, dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless days. Her movements were quick, purposeful. She seemed like someone who didn't like to linger, always in a hurry to get somewhere. But today, she was different. She looked more than just tired. Her face was pale, her hair slightly damp and sticking to her forehead, her breathing shallow. I asked if she's okay, my voice low. I could tell by the way she nodded quickly and hurried past me that she wasn't. Something had shaken her. But whatever it was, she clearly didn't want to talk about it. I watched her disappear down the stairs, her footsteps fading into the echo of the building. For a creature of habit, someone who had a routine, something about the way she looked today was off. It wasn't the usual exhaustion. It was fear. I continued up, the cold air from the stairwell following me into the dim hallway of the 6th floor. As I reached my door, that familiar weight settled back onto my chest, the one that had been there ever since she left. The apartment was cold when I stepped inside. I hadn't turned on the heat in days, and the rain outside only seemed to amplify the chill. I stood for a moment in the small living room, staring at the empty couch, remembering the comfortable couch in our old house by the fireplace, where we would sit and talk about our future, our plans, our baby. But the future never came. I tossed my hoodie on the chair and wandered into the kitchen, grabbing a paper cup from the cupboard. Paper because I'd been just too lazy to wash up. My mind drifting like it always did when I came back to this place. The silence was crushing. After so many months, you'd think I'd have gotten used to it. I was a workaholic, always had been, but even more so after we lost our child. I thought I was doing the right thing, working hard so that we could get back on to actually living. But I didn't see it. I didn't see how much she was suffering after the stillbirth. I couldn't see the way she was breaking down inside, the grief that was slowly killing her. I'd ignored the signs, too wrapped up in my own world, my own work. And when it finally became too much, she walked out. She left me, and I couldn't even blame her. I poured my coffee, trying to push the memories back, but they came flooding in anyway. Suddenly, the lights flickered. I frowned, glancing at the ceiling. It wasn't unusual for the building to have electrical issues, but this felt different. The air grew colder, heavier, as if something was pressing down on me. Then, I heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps, but not from the hallway, from inside the apartment. My breath hitched. I set the glass down, the sound ringing louder in the quiet room. It came again. Soft, hesitant footsteps. The kind you'd expect from someone walking lightly, as if they didn't want to be heard. I turned toward the bedroom, heart pounding, my mind racing through rational explanations. Maybe it was the neighbor upstairs. Maybe I was hearing things. But deep down, I knew better. The footsteps continued, this time moving slowly toward my bedroom. With trembling hands, I slowly walked toward the door, my footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. The narrow hallway seemed darker, the shadows longer, and I could feel something I couldn't explain, pulling me toward the bedroom. When I reached the door, it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking softly. But then I heard it, a soft giggle. I froze. It wasn't the laugh of a child, though. It was a broken, hollow sound, like someone who was laughing through tears. And then I saw her. In the corner of the room, sitting in the rocking chair, was a figure. Her head was bent forward, her long hair falling over her face. She was cradling something in her arms, something small, wrapped in a blanket. My heart stopped.
No.
She slowly lifted her head, and even though I couldn't see her face, I knew who it was.
Maddie,
Her voice was soft, almost a whisper.
why didn't you see me?
I stepped back, my hands shaking.
I didn't know.
The figure stood, her movements slow, deliberate, as she rocked the small bundle in her arms. The air grew colder still, the walls of the apartment seeming to close in around me.
You were never here.
She whispered.
I needed you, but you were never here.
I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The weight of my guilt, of everything I'd ignored, everything I'd failed to see, pressed down on me, suffocating me. She took a step closer, her face still hidden by her hair, her voice growing softer, more mournful.
We waited for you, Maddie.
I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as she came closer, the soft giggle turning into a sob. And then, just as she reached out her hand, the lights flickered again, and the room was empty. The rocking chair still, the air silent. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my heart racing. I couldn't be sure if I'd seen her, if any of it had been real. But the coldness remained, lingering in the air, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. And then I heard it. A faint whisper echoing through the empty room.
We're still waiting.
I fled. I grabbed my keys and ran, my feet pounding down the hallway, the walls closing in around me. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold rain soaking through my clothes. I didn't even realize the cup of coffee still in my hands. Part 5. Fourth floor. Cameron. It all started a week ago. The debt had been hanging over us like a noose for months. But when you owe people like the ones I'd gotten involved with, it's never just money. It's fear. It's waking up in the middle of the night because you think you heard someone at the door. It's checking your phone every 5 minutes for another threatening text. But this was something else. Something worse. I didn't tell Bonnie everything. I couldn't. But she could see the tension in me, the way I'd startle at the slightest sound, or stare at my phone like it might explode in my hands. We'd tried to keep it from Emma, to shield her from the mess we were in. But kids know. They always know. That night, a note had been slipped under our door. Plain white paper, no name, but I knew who it was from. Inside, scrawled in a shaky hand, was a message.
You can't hide from what's coming.
I crumpled it up, shoved it in my pocket, and told myself I'd deal with it later. Except later never came. Because later, in the wee mornings, the knocks started. At first, it was subtle. Just a few raps at the door, the kind you'd hear from a neighbor dropping by for sugar. But when I opened it, no one was there. The wind howled through the hallway, rattling the doors, making the lights flicker. Bonnie peeked out from under her covers, concern in her eyes, but I just shrugged it off.
Kids.
I muttered.
Probably messing around.
Then it happened again. Harder this time. More insistent. Emma had already gone to bed by then, curled up in her room with her favorite stuffed bear. Bonnie was nervous, kept asking if we should call someone, but what could I say? I didn't want to admit it, not to her, not to myself. The shadows in the hallway stretched long, too long, like they were creeping closer with every knock. That's when the lights went out. Pitch black. I stood frozen, holding the door handle. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold draft from somewhere deeper in the building. But it wasn't just the wind anymore. There was something there. Something watching. I felt Bonnie's hand on my arm. She whispered,
Cam, we need to leave.
Before I could answer, the knocking started again. This time, from inside the apartment. Bonnie's grip tightened, and I swear, for a second, I thought I heard Emma's voice down the hall, calling out. But no, she was asleep, wasn't she? Bonnie stepped back, her face pale as the moonlight that filtered in through the window. She looked at me, fear plain in her eyes, and I could see that she'd heard it too. That wasn't Emma's voice. It was something using her voice.
Go pack a bag.
I whispered.
We're leaving. Now.
But then came the text. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I pulled it out, the screen was lit up with a message.
If you run, we'll find her first.
My blood ran cold. Bonnie was already moving, grabbing Emma's coat, but I stood there, staring at the screen, paralyzed. The air felt thick, pressing in on me from all sides. I couldn't breathe. The shadows around us seemed to ripple, as if they were alive, writhing along the walls, coiling around the furniture. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was worse. Much worse. I didn't tell Bonnie about the text. I just grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the door.
Cam, we can't leave our daughter alone here.
She hissed.
I know. We'll leave a note.
I was grasping at straws, but I had to do something.
The old man on the 3rd floor. You know him. He's a good guy. He'll check on her if we don't come back in time.
I was trying to convince myself as much as Bonnie. We didn't know much about him, just that he was always there, sitting quietly on the bench near the mailboxes or shuffling out to the store. But Emma had taken to him immediately, in that way kids sometimes do with older people. He had a kindness to him, a calm that made you feel like he'd seen enough life to know when to worry and when not to.
He'll understand.
I added, more to fill the silence than anything else. I could feel Bonnie's hesitation, but we didn't have any other choice.
He'll keep an eye on her.
Bonnie bit her lip. She knew I was right, but that didn't make it any easier.
I hate leaving her.
I know, but we can't bring her.
My chest tightened at the thought of Emma, curled up asleep in her bed, completely unaware of the danger we were running toward.
She'll be safer here. Those men. If things go south, I don't want her anywhere near them.
Bonnie nodded, though I could see the conflict in her eyes. We both knew what we were walking into. A situation so far out of control that even with the money I'd managed to scrape together, it might not be enough. The men we owed weren't the kind you could reason with, but I had to try. I'd secured a portion of what we owed, just enough to maybe buy us time, a few more days to figure things out. We were going to meet them, beg for an extension, pray they didn't see through the desperation. But Emma couldn't be there. If something happened, if they turned on us, God, I couldn't even think about it.
We're doing the right thing,
I said, more to myself than her. Bonnie was still trembling as she pulled Emma's little coat off the hanger and laid it on the couch, where Emma could find it if the old man had to come for her.
You're sure about that old man?
He's the only one we can trust.
I swallowed hard.
Remember when Emma dropped her doll in the hallway last week? The old man picked it up and gave it back to her. He even knelt down, talked to her for a bit. She liked him. Said he reminded her of Grandpa.
Bonnie's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flicking toward Emma's bedroom. She didn't want to leave her, but we both knew it was the only way. We couldn't drag our daughter into the nightmare we were facing. I grabbed a pen and quickly scrawled a note. I pasted it on the old man's door, praying that he'd seen it, that he'd understand. I thought I heard a laugh. A low, guttural sound that came from behind us as we fled down the stairwell. But when I looked back, there was nothing there. Just the flickering lights, the storm raging outside, and that damned knocking still echoing in my ears. The air outside was thick with tension as we made our way down the stairs and out into the pouring rain. Our footsteps splashed through puddles as we hurried toward the grocery store at the corner of Kensington and Maple. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few early risers heading to work. We stepped into the store, the soft ding of the doorbell breaking the silence. The night shift worker was at the register, looking half asleep as she scanned through a few stray items. She glanced up as we entered, her eyes narrowing slightly in recognition. I could feel the weight of her gaze as we grabbed a couple of drinks and gum, trying to act like everything was normal. My hands were shaking, and I nearly dropped my wallet as I paid. As we left the store, the storm outside seemed to have gotten worse, the rain coming down harder now, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. We hurried down the street, my mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. As we sped off to the meeting spot, my phone buzzed again, and this time the message read,
You can't escape what's coming.
Epilogue. The Storm's Whisper. The storm wasn't just weather. It was a warning, a sign that something far more sinister had arrived in their lives. Each of them had heard the whispers, felt the presence lurking in their apartments, but none of them knew it had always been there, watching, waiting. The entity fed on the quiet, on the darkest corners of their minds. And as the rain hammered down, it moved between them, each one unknowingly tied to the next, all part of the same haunting. Each floor, each apartment, each life, interwoven by the same sinister force that had come with the storm. They thought they were alone, that their hauntings were separate, personal, but they were wrong. The quiet wasn't just quiet anymore. It was something far darker. Something that had been there all along, drawn out by the storm, and now it would never leave. So as you lie there, with the rain softly falling, and the thunder rumbling in the distance. Let the storm lull you into sleep. But don't forget, it's in these still, quiet moments, when the world is calm, that it thrives. And perhaps, when the rain finally stops, the whispering might begin again. The storm isn't quite over yet. Sleep well.
Void Visions AI.